Hi, my name is Sophie Dano, and this is my blood pressure practical exam video for Kinesiology 6151 at UNC Charlotte. And today I have my younger brother Henry serving as my patient. How are you today, Henry?
Good.
Great. All right, Henry, before we start our blood pressure measurement, I'm going to ask you a few screening questions, if that's okay.
It is.
Can you tell me the last time that you exercised?
Last night.
Okay. Have you smoked, taken any medications, had any alcohol or caffeine today?
I've had a soda today.
Okay, thank you for letting me know. So these questions are basically just to gauge if there's any factors that could influence your resting blood pressure. Caffeine being one of them, which is in soda, could potentially increase your blood pressure. So now that we know that might be a factor, we can put that into consideration for when we see your blood pressure results at the end, okay? Before we start our blood pressure measurement, I'm going to give you a quick run through about what we're going to be doing, okay? So first we're going to have you rest for a period of about 5 minutes, okay? That way we have more of a baseline for our measurement. And after we have our 5 minutes of rest period, I'm going to seat you properly in your seat. So we have, again, a proper measurement for your blood pressure, an accurate result. And then I'm going to measure your arm for a blood pressure cuff and make sure we have the right size. After that, we'll make sure that it's fitted right on your arm, over your brachial artery. After that, we'll inflate it and deflate it and take your blood pressure measurement, all right? Sound good?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The main goal for blood pressure measurement is to determine if there's any risk for cardiovascular disease, which is one of the reasons why we're doing this test. And before we begin, we're gonna have our 5 minutes of rest, but before that, we're gonna make sure that our patient is seated properly in the chair. So Henry, if you could put your feet flat on the ground for me, make sure your back is nice and straight and supported by this chair back here. And then make sure your arm is level on here with your palm facing up for me, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. And we're going to take 5 minutes of rest and come back. So before we start our blood pressure measurement, we're going to measure Henry's arm and make sure that we have the right blood pressure cuff for him. So we're going to lift up his shirt a little bit so we have a better reading. And we're going to take this tape measure that I have and measure his arm. And then we're going to compare that value to the value that I have on my blood pressure cuff, which as you can see here is 22 to 42 centimeters, which falls in line with Henry's arm circumference. So we are set to use this blood pressure cuff. So our next step is to put the blood pressure cuff on Henry's arm. So we're going to make sure that his t-shirt is rolled up all the way so that we have full access to his arm and that the clothing doesn't impact his blood pressure reading. And so we want to make sure that the cuff is completely deflated, which this one is, and we are going to place it over the brachial artery on his upper arm. And we want to make sure that the blood pressure cuff is about 1 inch above his elbow so that we have an accurate reading as well. So we are going to put this on. Henry, you can put your arm through there for me. Thank you very much. And we are just going to tighten it like so. So our next step is to palpate the radial pulse. So on Henry, we're going to find his radial pulse. Henry, if you can see your arm, thank you. Which for Henry is going to be about right here. And so our next step after locating the radial pulse is to inflate the blood pressure cuff. Now this is going to give us a systolic value, which is our range for when we are pumping up the blood pressure cuff for our manual blood pressure. Now this is just to kind of determine and eliminate any potential oscillatory gaps and to make it a little bit less uncomfortable for the patient. Now, oscillatory gap is also known as a silent gap, and this is when the Kartoff sounds are not able to be heard during blood pressure measurement, and this can lead to a lower reading for the systolic values. And then also with lessening any discomfort, this can potentially increase any resting blood pressure values. So we just kind of want to be aware of that before we start our blood pressure measurement to make sure that we are actually having accurate readings. So for Henry here, we are going to locate his radial pulse one more time, and we are going to inflate the blood pressure cuff until we can no longer hear his pulse right here. And once we have found that value on our little dial right here, we will add 20 to 30 millimeters of mercury to our systolic value later on for our range from we're trying to determine his resting blood pressure. So now I will start to inflate the cuff and take his radial pulse at the same time. You ready, Henry?
Mm-hmm.
Now for Henry, the value that I got was 135 millimeters of mercury. And so when we take his resting blood pressure later on, we're going to add about 20 to 30 milligrams of mercury onto that value. So we're going to kind of go for around the 150 range for Henry when we are taking his resting blood pressure. Now that we have palpated Henry's radial pulse, it is time to take Henry's resting blood pressure. And now we're going to make sure that his blood pressure cuff is still in the right position, which it is, and that our dial right here is at 0, which it is as well. Then it's deflated, ready to be pumped up. Now we're also going to make sure that our stethoscope is placed in the right place as well. So we're going to make sure that the stethoscope right here is placed kind of in the crook of his elbow. We don't want it to go under the lip of the blood pressure cuff, and we don't want to press down too hard or else we will not get an accurate reading. We also want to make sure that me as the technician doing his blood pressure, I'm wearing it correctly. And you want to make sure the earpieces go in like that. So I was able to measure Henry's blood pressure to be 124/72, which is slightly elevated blood pressure. The caffeine and soda that he had earlier could be an influence onto why his blood pressure was slightly elevated. His normal blood pressure is usually around that range, but that is a factor that needs to be considered for his blood pressure, is the caffeine he had earlier. So Henry, thank you very much for being such a great patient. I'm going to remove the blood pressure cuff and you may go about your day. Snip, and there we go. Thank you very much. Since my patient Henry had a slightly elevated blood pressure of 124/72 and not hypertensive, we're going to use an imaginary client whose blood pressure is 160/90, which is considered stage 2 hypertension. Now we are going to kind of discuss different ways that this individual can control their high blood pressure. One way they can do this is they can lose weight, they can exercise, they can reduce their sodium intake in their diet, and they can also discuss medication options with their doctor. And now another thing to consider is that Henry did have elevated blood pressure. However, we can't diagnose him with elevated blood pressure just on one reading. We're going to have to do multiple readings to guarantee that he actually does have elevated blood pressure.